Hello, and welcome to our What Matters 2024 presentation. Today, you're going to hear what people want for the future, what they say they want for the future, and we're going to give you a closer look into their behaviors and how they follow these aspirations. And our hope is we can use this knowledge to explore on how your brands can help fulfill on these needs in mutually beneficial ways to both society we live in and to your brand's bottom line. So, hello, I am Catherine Evelyn. I am the Managing Director of Humanate North America, and together with Alex, we're going to take you through our findings and what it means for brands. So Alex is our semiotics and cultural expert of Space Doctors, the creative and consultative agency within Humanate. So what are we talking about here? Well, the pressure on people and planet is at an all-time high. If we look around what's happening in the world, families are fleeing their homes due to political stability, armed conflicts. There's a cost of living crisis, and it continues to put pressure on budgets. And the repercussions of climate change are more visible than ever. What we're seeing is 8 out of 10 people are seriously worried about the future of our planet. They're also becoming increasingly aware of their own lack of agency to do anything about it, to make changes that they think are necessary at the scale that they want them done. And so what we're seeing is true power asymmetries in place here, made even more noticeable by inflation, the cost of living, and the continued growth and reach of institutions like government and companies as our own efficacy diminishes. And so what this means is there's really a driving, like a collective desire for change. And the question we're all asking is, how do we move from less harm to more good? And what is increasingly apparent to people is their interests are getting lost in the shuffle. And so we want a better world. We want to have a voice. And we're looking for companies to demonstrate values that clearly align with a commitment to improving the state of things beyond just an extraction first mindset, to use power for good. And so it's probably useful to name what it is we're talking about here, because what we're seeing is a real shift from sustainability to regenerative systems. And what this is being driven by is a need for demonstrable and positive change. And in short, what we're seeing is there's not a whole lot of excitement out there about the systems we have in place and the things that people see around them, because they don't see that these systems are working or are viable in terms of being a long-term path to change and to a better world. And if you ask me, the term sustainability itself can mean anything from general goodwill on the one hand to greenwashing on the other. And what people are actually looking for is something that is going to be connected to their own life and that regenerates value across all the interconnected domains that they live in. And so we describe this perspective as regenerative, and it is far more reaching than sustainability and all the things that are related to that. Regeneration is all around building mutually beneficial solutions and outcomes that help us realize that every decision we make is bigger than us. And regeneration affects a really broad ecosystem of connected things that at various scales. So if you think about the ecosystem you live in, the water you drink, the schools your kids are attending, working conditions, the products you buy, your own personhood, your community, all of these things are interconnected, and you are just a part of all of those things. So when we look at our society's current focus on maintaining the systems and communities and environments, this status quo mindset is not going to be enough. We need to fundamentally change the way we do things in order to safeguard the well-being of not only the present generation, but future generations as well. So this is really on all of us. And if we talk to people, they're telling us 85% of them say brands have a really important role and need to take responsibility in helping us with this. So what you're going to find today is in our presentation of what matters, we're going to help you understand what matters to people and how to act upon it. We're going to show you 4 dimensions of positive change. And within that, there's 8 different ways you can help drive this transformation. And they can start anywhere. They can be big or small. But what's really critical here is that we start now. So we're going to dig in before we get into the actual results. We're going to dig into how did we go about doing the study. So Alex is going to give you some specifics there.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, so I am from Space Doctors, and as we mentioned, we are the cultural and creative agency within Human 8. So I'm a project director specializing in foresight, trends, and cultural change makers. And I was also the lead on this report from the kind of cultural insight side, which was honestly such a treat for me because it's such an area of passion. And I know there's a lot of people who are, as we mentioned, very worried about the future. And as someone who works in the future, sometimes it can feel a little bit scary, but this report really gave me a lot of hope for what's to come. So you can see here our previous reports from kind of 2020 onwards, and we've explored quite a lot of topics from pandemic attitudes in 2020 to rebalancing and then finding a new meaning in life. When we started to think about which topic to focus on this year, something that we noticed was that in so many of our reports and, our ongoing projects, that the real interest and energy was on change towards a better future for people and for the planet. So this is why we focused this year on the kind of cultural landscape of positive transformation. And we know that we often present these kind of really inspiring futures, and you can read really inspiring kind of trend reports. And the question that we often get from people and from clients is that, that's great, but how do I get there? So this report really explores the types of change that are taking place to give you some more kind of tangible inspiration on the how, not just the what or the why. So when you work with kind of consumer research, it's about getting close to people, right? It's about, communities and surveys and really understanding what matters to people today. Whereas at Space Doctors, we look through the lens of culture. We start with culture, how culture is changing and the impact that will have on the future. So this is things that consumers wouldn't be able to tell you yet. They might not know even how those ideas got into their heads, and we use culture to tell you how it got there. So we use methods like semiotics to look at cultural meaning, and then we apply that to think about your future strategies. And if you've never worked with semiotics before, you'll have a pretty good understanding by the end of this presentation, hopefully. So this year we did start with a semiotic and cultural analysis, and we used our network of in-market semioticians who are on the ground in different markets and different places all over the world and can really get us into the nuance of culture. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But we also used cultural AI, which we actually call collaborative intelligence. And that's really just taking cultural analysis that we find, and then we feed it through our data analysis tools, which then scrape from blogs, social media, etc. And we see these kind of visual and verbal cues on these topics and also how they're changing. We also spoke to our Illum network, who are a global network of cultural change makers. And these are people who are really trying to disrupt or make a change in the category that they're interested in. They exist on the edges of culture. So they really bring us to the fringes where the exciting and different things are happening that we can track. But they also have quite a strong point of view usually, which is really helpful for us. So from that, we came up with our map and our codes, which we'll go into shortly. But this cultural foundation was fed into a community and quant study to really get close to how people are feeling about these codes of the future today. So for the global insight community, we connected with 69 consumers from 10 markets in kind of a 2-week insight community to give some context to these transformation codes and our sort of hypotheses. Creative tasks and discussions allowed us to kind of capture the drivers, the barriers, the frictions, and the needs that people are kind of experiencing with each of these codes and how they're already manifesting in some ways in people's lives. And then we also did a quantification study in 17 markets. So we really wanted to understand how these changes are manifesting worldwide and to what extent this is happening. So we surveyed over 13,000 consumers in 17 markets. And this global quantification uncovered how prominent these changes are. What is the say-do gap that people are experiencing here, which we can talk about in a little bit more detail later on. and also the sector playing field for each code as well. So this was a really nice piece where we partnered together with Human8, Space Doctors and Human8, part of the same kind of family, and bringing the best of our capabilities together. So let's get into our map of positive transformation. And this is really the starting point, the bare bones of the map. And we always start with the axes, which draw on tensions from all across the landscape as we're doing our analysis. And we're looking at what's emergent, what's different, what's disruptive, what's changing. So we saw this tension between change that is focused versus expansive, and then change that is mediated versus change that is more kind of organic. So let's look at those axes in a little bit more detail. And it can feel a little bit complicated if you've never used a semiotic map before, but you can always pop comments below this video and we can try and answer your questions. So on the vertical axis, we have mediated change, which is about change that is shaped and direct. And here we're approaching challenges with awareness of and influence over existing systems. So you might be harnessing expertise or deep knowledge. And then conversely to that, we have organic change, which is dynamic and amorphous. And this type of change really flourishes and grows as it builds. It might change direction, and it's really fed by lived experience. That's what is sustaining this type of change. On the horizontal axis, we have focus, where positive change is approached with precision and often that kind of deep technical understanding. So we're spotlighting problems, we're isolating those barriers to change, and we're really enabling quite specific solutions with our resources. And then expand on the other side. So this is about looking at approaching change with kind of more radical philosophies and big imagination. We're pursuing absolute sea change, reframing the narrative completely and imagining a completely new way of being. So those tensions then bring us to our 4 dimensions of positive change. And in semiotics, this could look at a category, it could look at an idea, but here we are looking at positive transformation. So we look at how those tensions intersect, and that's what brings us to these themes. So the first one here between mediated and expand is courageous vision. And here we're looking for bold ideas and visions that are revolutionizing the way that we think. And then between expand and organic, we have rethink and thrive. So this is really about challenging conventional paths and exploring alternative forms of organization. Between organic and focus, we have empowered minds. And this theme is really about enabling and empowering everyday people to become change makers themselves. And then between focus and mediated, we have surgical solutions. So here we're looking for precise and really focused actions that importantly are not incremental, but it's about having that exponential impact. And from those quadrants, we really look at how they're showing up differently in culture because they show up in so many different ways. And these are kind of sub-themes within those themes. And we think about them as clusters of meaning. And in semiotics, we call them codes, cultural codes. So here you can see how they sit across the map. And these are really all the different ways that we saw positive transformation and change showing up globally. And what you might want to think about as we talk through them is, which of these codes are more relevant to me, my brand, my business now? Which might be more relevant in the future? Which do we kind of just need to be aware of? Or which codes are some of our competitors playing into, for example? So let's look at an example of a code. And as I explained, we really looked at how these 8 codes are manifesting in people's lives through the community and how much they are showing up in people's lives via this global survey that we did. So for each of the transformation codes, we'll kind of show the data story in the following way. On the left-hand side, you can see the overall placement of the code in terms of identification and behavior in comparison to others. So this zoom in really highlights regional nuances in which markets a code has a higher identification and or behavior compared to other markets. And the global average is kind of indicated by that little black dot. And this is a different framework to the mapping of positive transformation that we've just gone through. So there's a couple of maps going on. There's the cultural framework, which is the map of positive transformation. And then this axis, which is about identification and behavior, which is based on the quantitative study. You'll also see a quote for each code that kind of illustrates what people think and feel regarding this space, this sub-theme. And this came from the online community that we shared our cultural codes with. The overall say-do gap for each code really kind of illustrates the gap between consumer identification and actual behavior. So a bigger gap kind of highlights the opportunity space for brands to help people to act upon their intentions. Then on the upper right side of this slide, we zoom in on the generational differences when it comes to the say-do gap, which is really interesting to break down and think which codes might be more relevant for different generations. So that's kind of the end of our introduction, and the rest of this, we'll go into the rest of the presentation now. So we'll have the detail about the 8 cultural themes of change and the 4 dimensions of positive transformation overall. So you can feel free to use the kind of YouTube timestamps to navigate through to those codes that feel more relevant to you and to your brand, bearing in mind that it is always important to be aware of everything that's happening in culture and those other spaces that you might want to not think about now but think about soon, and those ones that your competitors might be playing into also. So let's start with the 2 codes that are in the courageous vision quadrant. So remember, this space on the map is all about path breaking, taking risks, and leading by example. To start with, we can look at negative fuel. And negative fuel is really this kind of cultural space where we are accepting the mistakes of the past and the mess that we've kind of made, whether that's kind of planetary or socially. But at the same time, we are still working towards a positive future. So here we might be talking about a physical transformation, for example, integrating plastic waste into a circular system, or something social, for example, acknowledging a really outdated idea and using it to directly help the people that may have been oppressed by it. And when we deep dive into the numbers behind negative fuel, we can see that people worldwide are really expressing this high identification and behavior with this code, which is why we find it in that upper right quadrant when we're plotting it against the kind of identification and behavior axes. So this means that not only are people kind of believing that we need to take the negative and turn it into something positive, they're already taking action in this space. One market that we saw quite a high identification for this is South Africa. And we know as a nation that is very conscious of its past and its history, there is a lot of openness to really acknowledge the negative and find ways to, turn it into something positive. Whether we're part of the problem or not, it's our responsibility to be part of the solution, which one of our participants from the South African study here said, even if I was not part of either social or environmental damage in the past, it affects me now. So I need to take ownership and help in fixing what was damaged by doing the right things. A market where we saw a low identification with this code is the UAE. So a potential kind of cultural explanation for this might be the high number of expats we see in that region that are perhaps there for work or staying for a short period. So, it might be about feeling less connected to or less aware of that historical damage from the past. For this code, we have a global say-do gap of 29%, which really reflects the difference between identification and behavior and highlights the opportunity for brands to help turn this intention into action. Brands and organizations can do this by really critically evaluating both their past and present actions and introducing smart and creative ways to turn perhaps something negative that we are contributing to or creating into something positive. And when we look at generational differences, we see the high identification across generations, but a difference in behavior with younger generations already acting more upon this. So 53% of them are currently already engaging with brands and people that turn the damage from the past into something positive. And this really makes sense considering kind of that awareness that we see within the younger generations, the way that they're really actively educating themselves. In culture, the example here is from a beer brand in the US called Miller Lite. And Miller Lite really want to acknowledge their historically harmful representation of women in their beer advertisements. So they've collected old sexist print ads and posters, including their own, and ground them up into fertilizer. And this fertilizer was then given to 200 female brewers to help them grow hops and gain a foothold in a very male-dominated industry.
Here's a little known fact. Women were among the very first to brew beer ever. From Mesopotamia to the Middle Ages to colonial America, women were the ones doing the brewing. Centuries later, how did the industry pay homage to the founding mothers of beer? They put us in bikinis. Wow. Look at this wild. It's time beer made it up to women. So today, Miller Lite is on a mission to clean up not just their but the whole beer industry's Miller Lite has been scouring the internet for all this and buying it back so that they can turn it into good for women brewers. Literally, good How, you ask? Ladies, take it away.
First, we turn the bad into compost. Then we feed compost to worms. Push out beautiful fertilizer.
That good helps farmers grow quality hops, which is then donated to women brewers to make their own really good
But there's definitely more out there. In your attic, in the garage, in your parents' basement. Send any you got into Miller Lite and they'll turn that into good too. Oh. So here's to women, because without us, there would be no beer.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on to the next transformation code, which is manifesting manifestos. And I think we're all conscious of the future that we aspire to and the world we want to live in, but sometimes we feel powerless on how we're going to make a change. And so what we need are front runners and inspirational figures to challenge the existing norms and to lead with a fresh perspective and inspire through actions and renouncing things that don't align with bringing us closer to positive change. So let's dig into this code a little bit more. And the quote that we're going to show you here is from Singapore, and it really illustrates what this code is all about. If we plot manifesting manifestos on our identification and behavior axes, what we see here is that we're in the upper right-hand quadrant. So people identify with it and act on this idea of needing people and brands with a clear vision to take the lead and act. And so then if we look at specific markets within this upper quadrant, we see Brazil scores rather high on both identification and behavior. And we think we can explain this on how the people of Brazil have been living under a challenging political climate for years. And now they're looking very hopefully towards the future. They see their own Brazilian brands like Natura Cosmetics wanting to make a difference and feel committed to do the same. If we look at the UK, we also see higher identification with this code. And we can probably attribute this to people's growing frustration with how things have been going in this past year. If you look at Brexit, the cost of living crisis, increasing energy costs, people are really longing for visionary people and brands to take the lead and install change. So let's look at the data a little bit more closely. What we see here is a global say-do gap of 31%. So meaning people either aren't sure what to do about it, how to do it. It might be that they want or need help support, or it could be that they lack the authority to even do anything about it. When we look at the generational picture here, we see again, there's a fairly big difference between the younger generation, the older generation in terms of acting on it. What we see is younger generations are actually starting to walk the talk. And if we look to the future, we can only expect more of this from our younger generations. So if we want to give an example of what this looks like, we're going to show you Triodos, which is a financial institution based in the Netherlands. And their whole goal is to make money a force for good. And their mission really revolves around providing finance to enterprises that are actively engaging and contributing to enhancing the quality of life while delivering benefits to both society and the environment. And they have 4 key core values. The first one is transparency. So every financial institution that they are working with is on their website, and you can see all the details. Entrepreneurship, they are particularly interested in providing help for value-based businesses that are providing support for marginalized populations. Sustainability, a lot of the work is focused on renewable energy systems and excellence. So Triodos, through a blend of global and local initiatives, is ensuring that the values that they hold so deeply are ingrained in every action, and really fostering a financial landscape where positive impact thrives. Another example I'd like to share with you is work that we've done here at Humanate. So Philips has really boldly shifted its innovation focus, evolving into a health technology company committed to enhancing people's well-being. And to support this transformation, we have been collaborating with Philips to develop a new innovation practice that's centered on human understanding. And this approach really prioritizes ongoing interactions and engagement with stakeholders, fostering this people-centric mindset throughout the journey. And so through a continuous learning practice, and this is really fueled by an online community we have with over 3,500 participants, Philips has made significant strides in improving lives and solidifying its reputation as an innovative leader in the health tech industry.
Moving on to our next quadrant. So we are on the bottom right of the map here between expansive and organic change. And again, we'll explore both the codes here, starting with decentralized networks. So this code is really focused on people today having seen what were previously thought of as quite solid institutions like banks, the housing market, governments fail. So these kind of fringe or alternative ways of being don't seem as risky in comparison as they might have done previously. So you might think about things like cryptocurrencies here, but this really incorporates all decentralized approaches where everyone in the network has a say about the future. So looking at the data here, the 2 consumer quotes from an Australian and a US participant really showcase quite clearly what that decentralization means to people. It's about addressing the ways that our current systems don't work for us. We're looking to build something fairer. And if we plot this code on the identification and behavior axes, we see that we are in the lower left quadrant. So this means that this code is still kind of niche and less outspoken, both in identification and behavior. A market with particularly low identification is China, where we know that government intervention in people's lives is pretty high. And the ability to really create and forge those more kind of independent or alternative systems is much harder, and also sometimes restricted by law. Germany is also an outlier here, with higher behavior than other markets. So culturally, we're kind of seeing this attitude from Germany that people are pushing back on the perceptions of the country as this kind of hyper-organized place, and those sort of outdated stereotypes. So the behavior here is becoming higher. For this code, we have a global say-do gap of only 8%. So this is quite a nascent code with that low identification and behavior globally. But brands really can lead in this space by empowering people and communities with initiatives that really inspire that decentralized thinking, whether it's through your customers or maybe even the people that work for you. So we're really supporting alternative networks and learning from emerging organizations that are doing things in a way that just feel fairer to people. And when we look at generational differences, we do already see a higher identification and behavior among the kind of youngest generations compared to Gen X or baby boomers. And this makes sense if we think about how connected young people are to each other and how they have those kind of more opportunity to discover these decentralized ways of being online or through social media. New ideas, startups, and alternative systems are something they are much more likely to have tried or, be kind of open to in that space. From culture, the example that we see here is Patreon, a platform that helps diverse content creators set up and run a subscription service for their creative work and sell kind of digital products. It allows creators to monetize their work as well, really importantly. So we're offering fans a way to directly support the creatives that they care about to make more of the work that they love.
All right, and moving on to the second code within Rethink and Thrive, sharing is daring. The cost of living crisis has forced a lot of us to rethink how we spend our money, and the throwaway culture of our past really isn't viable anymore. People are recognizing the negative impact on both people and the planet. And I think what's happening is we're increasingly questioning the definition of value. Value used to be determined by transaction and ownership, and now sharing is becoming the new currency. Similar to what we saw in decentralized networks, sharing is daring is in the lower left quadrant, meaning it's a nascent code. And yet, when we look at where all the markets land on this, we see China. China is actually showing higher identification of behavior, and that would make it an expanding code within China. And sharing with friends and family is deeply rooted in Chinese culture since ancient times. But even today, we see that sharing bikes, for instance, with strangers is becoming increasingly popular in the larger cities. This consumer quote from the Chinese participant is a great example of sort of this positive stand for the sharing economy. On the other hand, if we look at South Africa, we see very low identification and behavior. And this could be explained by the fact that South Africa is a developing nation and resources are scarce there and there's less to share. Put on top of that the fact that there's this large divide between the rich and the poor, it's not contributing to this idea of installing sharing as a new currency. When we look at the global say-do gap for this particular code, we see that brands do have a role in helping convert beliefs into actions. They can do this by rethinking current business models, providing alternative routes that go beyond simply owning goods. And we see that this is going to be especially true amongst the older generations, where we see only 1 in 4 has even explored alternatives to owning. So there's lots that brands can do to help educate and show the way here. In terms of examples, so Vestiaire Collective urges people to think first and buy second. And if you don't know what Vestiaire Collective is, it's a secondhand marketplace for luxury fashion. And the video you're seeing is part of their provocative campaign called Think First, Buy Second. And what they do is call out consumption driven by the fast fashion industry and revealing textile waste dumped on the street so people can actually see what it looks like. The whole idea is bringing waste closer to home, educating consumers on saying no to fast fashion. Another example, and this is based on work that Humanate has done, is really exploring the theme of circularity across different categories. So including furniture, and specifically furniture for children or jewelry. And what these sectors have in common is they are highly emotional and they have a strong social component. So what we found when we've been looking at circularity within these categories is it's one thing to explore the active circularity as it's proposed by manufacturers, but this often lies in contrast to the very emotionally charged dimension of ownership. So think about a piece of jewelry, really very personal, and ownership is an important part of that emotion. So when we look at ideas and strategies around circularity, we have to take these emotions into account. So it's also about building circular stories that ideally leverage these emotions if they're going to resonate with consumers. So a lot of times it's just a matter of wording. So if you think about H&M, they have moved from pre-owned to pre-loved. And it's just a minor shift in wording, but it makes a big difference in how you think about that category. All right, so not everyone is in a position where their voices are heard, but change often lies with these marginalized perspectives. So we're going to look at the code called Empowered Minds, which is all around enabling and empowering everyday people to become change makers. And by devolving power and authority, we're turning them from believers into doers. As we look at where this lands on our map, it's really leaning more into the dimensions of the precise side of the spectrum, as well as to the more organic, dynamic side as well. So there are two codes we'll cover here. The first is going to be director's chair. And the idea behind director's chair is you cannot judge a situation you've never been in. And people who have experienced injustices themselves know best what needs to change. I think if we're being honest, more often than not, key decision makers typically are not those that have experienced injustices. And even if they want to make change, they don't even know where to start all the time. So this code is all about giving a platform and a voice to those with a vision for change. And whether it be societal or other barriers, maybe they've lacked the chance to act up until now. So as we dig into director's chair, we see that we end up overall in the top right quadrant. But what's interesting as you look at this map is you see it's actually somewhat spread across all the quadrants, showing that there's quite a bit of differentiation by market on this one. So in the UK, for example, we see really high levels of behaviors, which aligns with the current political landscape. Left-wing ideologies are gaining prominence. There's a strong movement focusing on raising awareness and providing support to less privileged groups. And this sentiment really permeates through society. We have a nice quote here that describes it really well from the UK. We also see that Australia scores relatively high on identification of behavior. And when we try to think about why that might be, well, it could be that we're increasingly seeing that the empowerment of First Nation communities is high on the agenda and people's minds. And there are many initiatives right now trying to aiming at giving Aboriginal Australians greater influence over the decisions that affect them. We also see that the US sits squarely in the upper quadrant here, and over the past several years in the United States, we've seen a rise of marginalized voices and call for actions in the areas of social unrest, the Me Too movement, women's ability to make choices about their own bodies and health, LGBTQ rights, all of those things. So for this particular code, we have a say-do gap of 24%. And if we look more at the generational piece, what we see is both higher identification and behavior among the younger generations. What's interesting here is that we see almost half are already acting on this code, but we still have a 22% say-do gap there, which says there's still room for brands to help close this gap between intention and action. And how do brands do that? Well, it's going to be to recognize and support the people that are often unheard, not only giving them a voice to tell their stories, but also helping to install the change that they need. So as we think about examples, and this is one of my very favorite examples, this is the Restaurant of Mistaken Orders. It is an initiative from Japan where the people working in the restaurant are generally older and all of them suffer from dementia.
We opened a limited period pop-up restaurant where all the waiting staff are dementia patients. And what do we call ourselves?
もうちゃんの、あ、そっちだ。ごめんなさい、これ。これ
聞いとって忘れるんやけど、ごめんなさいね。
ご注文の、なんだっけ。言えないですよね。やっぱおしゃれで、お料理がすごく美味しく。でもその結果、間違えてしまったら、笑ってごめんねって、全然いいですよって言える、そういうコミュニケーションが一番大事。看板を掲げることで、間違えてもまあいいかっていう認知症があってもなくても、心がとても軽くなる。ハッピーな空気が生まれたんじゃないかな。
We think this is just a fantastic example of putting people that are often disregarded by society in the director's chair. It's not all about inclusivity and diversity, but it's also about empowerment. I think sometimes we forget that inclusivity includes dimensions like age and physical and mental abilities. And sometimes inclusive campaigns have a tendency to focus on the more immediately attractive aspects of inclusivity. So one of the reasons we love this example.
Next, we can look at flip the script. So this code comes from the idea that people are really sick of fighting for a seat at the table which is actively excluding them. So instead, they're creating their own table, which is fairer and more representative of the type of change they want to see. So this is still something that's emerging as these alternatives are kind of building and coming into play. But we did hear from people that we need to strive to see each other as individuals and hear those different perspectives. So while director's chair is located on the upper right quadrant, flip the script can really be found on the left-hand side of the data framework. So lower identification across all markets, but a division between markets actually when it comes to acting on this code. So South Africa, for instance, is in the top left quadrant with lower identification, but relatively high behavior. So people are acting on this type of change, but there are kind of those lingering divisions within the country that might be an explanation for why the identification is slower to catch up with this. And there's a quote from our South African participant which really illustrates this. You know, it's not always easy to flip the script. Where I'm working, we have so many labeled boxes, especially with the color of your skin, your sexuality. It's draining. It's, you know, you feel like you can't even fight it. It's sad and it's painful. So you can really hear the high levels of emotion that are related to this code. France is also in the kind of lower left quadrant, meaning that the behavior is lower on this code. But from this market, we often see quite a lot of critical thinking and questioning in relation to brands and bigger organizations in general. So people are really aware of and worried about claim washing in relation to the things that are going on within this code. And they're really interrogating what brands are truly doing in this space, which might prevent them from acting upon this. For this code, we have a smaller global say-do gap of 9%. So brands can really start to play a role here by supporting those new ways of thinking and acknowledging the people that they might have excluded before. When we look at generational differences, we see a slightly higher identification with those kind of next-gen audiences, but especially in behavior here, we really see that young people are really surpassing the older generations. Almost half of them already act upon this code, indicating that young people really kind of put their money where their mouth is. They want to engage with, but they also want to purchase from brands and organizations that champion diversity in this way. We're thinking about inclusion by empowering others to flip the script on the narratives that they might have been excluded by. For the cultural example here, we can see that it's often the case that these new systems and these new ways of being make the old institutions seem kind of outdated and behind the times by comparison. So Starling Bank's Make Pocket Money Equal campaign really highlighted the inequalities in pocket money between girls and boys, and also the financial literacy that starts to take place there. So they really highlighted that the gender pay gap starts early. Girls get 20% less pocket money than boys on average, while products marketed at girls often cost 5% more. So Starling Bank really wanted to create that change and give girls an equal start with this campaign. An example here from a project that we worked on was really about helping Barbie become a more powerful role model for young girls. So in the past, the Barbie brand had kind of faced criticism for perpetuating those narrow gender and beauty standards among girls, which something now we're all probably quite aware of. But when the team at Mattel approached us at Space Doctors, they knew that they needed a much deeper understanding of how Barbie could culturally reclaim her status as a positive role model, one that kind of champions that sort of boundless potential of girls worldwide by showing them that. So in response to changing culture, we found that Barbie really needed to reclaim that status. And we explored the diverse social and cultural issues that are really holding girls back from achieving their potential. And we identified some powerful new stories and narratives that the brand could tell. And this work that we did with Barbie directly influenced the quite inspirational Barbie Dream Gap campaign, which has been kind of widely praised for raising awareness of those key issues which limit girls' self-belief in the first place and stops them from achieving that future success. So this has been reflecting the kind of changing narrative and cultural association we've seen from the Barbie brand to inspire young girls. Moving on to the top left of the map here, we are looking at that kind of focused and mediated change. And the code that we'll start with in this section is pressure points. So pressure points, this code is really centered around seeking solutions that release a significant wave of change. We're applying resources to a focused action. So critically, as I mentioned, this is not about being incremental, but understanding the priorities and the blockers to greater change. Looking at the data story, starting with this quote from an Australian participant really conveys the sentiment around this and around this code really well. People want to understand what they can actually do to have substantial impacts. And pressure points is situated in the top right of the identification behavior framework. In most markets, people identify with this code and also act upon it. Brazil, for instance, scores relatively high on both identification and behaviour. And we know that in Portuguese there is a specific slang word which literally means a little way and relates to the kind of Brazilian cultural practice of finding a way to accomplish something greater by cleverly kind of bending the rules or maybe even finding a quick shortcut. In the UK, there's also very high identification with this code, and a potential explanation for this could be that lingering frustration that we've already discussed about, social and economic instability and inequality, and it's really fueling a desire for those concrete actions that people just want to know what they can do to unleash this greater wave of change. For this code, we have a global say-do gap of 29%, so there's that big opportunity there. And when we look at generational differences, we see a high identification across all generations, but next gen are really standing out with higher behavior. More than half of them already act upon this code, but with the say-do gap there, you can see that there is plenty of opportunity for brands to communicate and look for those concrete, targeted actions brands can make to have an exponential impact and to help people understand how they can contribute to this. From culture, we've got this example here from OGX. So we've heard that 2 in 3 women have experienced negative comments about their hair in the UK, leaving them feeling self-conscious and in some cases, quite offended. And in response to these findings, OGX launched their Life Affirming Hair campaign, which included a change.org petition calling for the Oxford English Dictionary to change those kind of offensive and negative hair definitions in the dictionary and remove the kind of derogatory usage examples such as mousy or dull. And we know this is really prevalent as well for Afro-Caribbean hair, with words like frizzy being used quite a lot by beauty brands and solutions that are based around controlling or managing curls as if they're a problem or something negative rather than something to be celebrated. We also have a project example here from Nestle, from work that we did. And although we know recycling is not a solution to that kind of overconsumption that we are creating for ourselves, we could see this as a really good example of pressure points, as it is a small targeted action that had the potential to release a greater wave of change. So our work with Nestle Australia was looking at wanting to understand people's attitudes and habits around recycling. So we invited 120 Australians to an online community where they participated in open discussion topics and ethnographic diaries. Consumers went on recycling missions, uploaded videos, completed surveys to really give us a 360 view of their habits and needs. And we discovered this kind of whole range of fresh recycling insights, which highlighted the say-do gap that people don't recycle as well as they believe they do. And too much focus lies on waste recycling and not enough on reusing and reducing in the first place. And as we know that younger generations like Gen Alpha and Gen X actually identify themselves as pre-cyclers. They're thinking about how they can dispose of packaging before they even purchase a product in the first place. This is something that's really important for brands to start to consider.
All right, great. And I'm going to cover our final code, which is inventive applications. Many of our existing systems, networks, supply chains, they're not being used to their full potential, or they're becoming obsolete. So if you think about all the outdated manufacturing lines that are out there, the empty offices since we've moved to remote and hybrid. So being aware that we don't have unlimited resources, people are looking for new and creative ways to maximize the use of existing systems and assets. And so this particular code is located on the upper right quadrant, meaning people both identify it with it and are acting upon it. And similar to pressure points, when we looked at that one, we saw Brazil high on both identification behavior. The same thing with inventive applications. And this probably relates back to the country's culture of craftsmanship and creativity. And that's further been fueled by the financial crisis. It's ingrained in Brazilian culture to upcycle and find new purposes for existing products. There's huge communities within the country of catadores, and these are waste collectors that pick up, for example, cans and recycle them and turn them into new products. We see the US here lies close to the global average. And a great example of this code that we heard from one of our US participants in our community is this idea of railroads being transformed into walking or biking trails for people to enjoy the outdoors. We see a rather large global say-do gap on this particular code, 38%, indicating there's a high potential for brands to step in here. And when we look at the generational differences, it's interesting. We see it doesn't matter what generation you're from, there's a high identification with this code. But we see the highest actual behavior amongst next gen. And it's not surprising if you think about everything you see on TikTok right now, right? With all the videos around upcycling and DIY and thrift flipping. So while older generations do identify with the code, they're acting less upon it, leaving room for brands to step in and play a role and help them close that gap. And they can do this by helping people find new and innovative ways to use their existing resources and systems to avoid them becoming underutilized or obsolete. An example of what this looks like in action is Lego Braille bricks. And Lego is really applying the practices of play to learning here. And so these Lego Braille bricks are designed to help children learn Braille. The bumps on the blocks themselves have been modified to correspond to a letter or character of the Braille alphabet. And so while they're applying the principles of learning through play, they're also helping kids learn Braille while being inclusive to those who are have partial or impaired sight. And so in addition, they also are facilitating educators in the classroom by offering online courses on how to interact with the bricks.
Lisa and Matt and their two young daughters are sat. They open a box of Lego Braille bricks. Lisa to camera.
Olivia lost her vision at such a young age. The whole way that she's learned about the whole world, essentially, is through sensory touch.
Lisa.
Do you want to find your name in the bricks?
Olivia.
I've got an A already.
An A?
She was first introduced to Lego Braille bricks in her class at school.
I think I normally use Braille in my books and at school. I started it in reception and my Braille teacher taught it to me.
The fact that we've now have that at home has just changed everything.
So what do we want you to take away here? It's really that actions speak louder than words. Be the change you want to see in the world by taking a stand and leading by example. Inspire others with a fresh point of view, and don't be afraid to make sacrifices for the greater good. And the time to do that is now. that's what we have for you today. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you want to learn more about the 8 codes for positive transformation, you can download our full report on the website. You can leave comments, as Alex mentioned, in the comment section. And we're excited to share more and dig deeper into this with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.